Hey, hi everybody. My name is Perdomo, Meza, and I'm going to give a talk called Passing Network Motifs, Convincing Quantification of Team and Player Passing Style. But before I get into passing motifs, I wanted to take a step back and discuss something a bit more general. And the thing I want to discuss is operationalizing or vectorizing raw football information. So I'll explain what I mean through an example. Very easy example. Take players' blocks during a match. You can take this information and say something like, this player made 16 blocks in that match. And you're going to use that number 16 to do whatever sort of thing that you're planning on doing. But you could also easily just arbitrarily define 4 zones and now say something like, he had 1 block in zone 4, 2 blocks in zone 3, etc., etc. So the same underlying information, the same raw information led you to either one number or a set of 4 different numbers. So this step isn't always obvious, and it isn't trivial. It's sometimes overlooked. And in my presentation, I hope to show you a way of operationalizing some data that's kind of new and really interesting with some nice results. Now the key thing is that when you have a set of numbers representing a player or a team, you could think of that team or that player as being a point in a measurable space. So I guess all the mathematicians in the crowd probably get this, but to explain it to those of you who don't really think in this sort of way, when you have 3 variables about a player, you have age, height, and weight. Then you can take a player and say something like, this player is 20 years old, he is 175 tall, and he is 70 kilos heavy. So you'll think of him like a point in space. And then you can plot all the different players. And you're going to have players appearing in different areas. You're going to have some tall, heavy, and old center backs in one area. You're going to have some short, skinny, and young wingers in another area. You're going to be able to measure distances between players, distances between areas. And this is true even in high dimensions. So I just gave you an example in 3 dimensions where you can imagine it. You can imagine points hanging around the auditorium. But even if you have 5, 6, 10, 100, 200 numbers, the same idea applies. You can see players or data points as points in the measurable space, and you can measure distances and look at where some certain types of players are occurring in certain areas, etc. Now the question is, can we use this approach of thinking of players in a space and discover something that we might want to know about them? Something like talent or skill or potential, something like this. So an example from a sophisticated industry that uses this, let's think about banks. So banks will take information about their respective customers and they'll take as many numbers as they can attributed to each customer. Salary, education, number of siblings, number of children, and they'll plot them in space. They'll take all their historical clients and paint them green for the ones who paid a loan, and paint the ones who didn't pay a loan red. So you're going to have a ton of green and red points around in the space. And when a new client comes along, you see where his points in that space, and you're going to try and use that idea to make a decision. So you can maybe draw a border between the 2 groups and see which side of the border this new point falls in, or you're going to use a k-nearest neighbor algorithm. They feel that by looking at prospective clients in this way, you can, by seeing where they are in respect to previous clients, answer something valuable about them, such as whether or not they will pay a loan. And the question that us in football analytics want to answer is, can we use this type of approach to help by the club's recruitment policy? And hopefully in my talk I will give you an example of precisely how we can do this. So on to passing motifs. The original idea comes from a paper called Searching for Unique Style in Soccer. It's by Rodriguez, Germany, and Bach. I think Laszlo Dermati was scheduled to appear and couldn't make it. Probably good for the questions part. So basically what they did is they took passing sequences and they would quantify them like this. So look at that first block of passes. Kane passes to Wilshere, Wilshere passes to Rooney, Rooney passes to Kane. It's a 3-pass long subsequence. So it starts with one player, Kane, we'll call him player A, goes to a second player, Wilshere, call him player B, a third player, Rooney, call him player C, and then it goes back to that first player, Kane. So we'll call that an ABCA, right? The second block is Wilshere passing to Rooney, Rooney passing to Kane, Kane passing to Rooney. Starts with that one player, Wilshere A, goes to the second player, Rooney, player B, goes to a third player, Kane, player C, and then goes back to Rooney, which was player B. So we'll call it an ABCB. Now all in all, when we count the different possibilities for 3-pass long subsequences, there's going to be 5 possible categories: ABAB, ABAC, ABCA, ABCB, and ABCB. So what we can do is we can take teams passing sequences and count how many times they perform each of these sequences. Now, the original idea from the authors is that if you look at the relative frequencies with which each team performs each category, you could say something about passing style. So you're going to say this team performs 20% of their sequences as an ABAB, 15% as an ABAC, etc., etc. If you think back to what we were talking about, seeing these teams as points in a 5-dimensional space, because you have 5 numbers attributed to them, precisely we're going to take these 5 numbers, plot them in that space, and see what sort of information, such as passing style, we can obtain from that idea. What the authors did was they analyzed teams from La Liga, and they found that Barcelona has a unique passing motif frequency style. And in particular, what they do is they use ABAB and ABAC more frequently than ABCD, more frequently than other teams, and ABCD less frequently. And this kind of makes sense when we think about Barcelona, because ABAB and ABAC are sequences that have 1 2s, while ABCD involves 4 different players. So kind of makes sense according to what we think we know about Barcelona. So I replicated the methodology for the Premier League. So let's look at this couple of graphs for a second. Remember, what we have is each team being in a 5-dimensional space, and we want to extract information from that. So these are 2 well-known data mining methods that kind of can try and do that, extract information from these data visualizations. Interesting is on the left we have clustering, and we can see that Leicester are the team that joins a cluster last, meaning something like they are the farthest away from any other team in their style for this 5-number vector. And when they do join a subgroup, it contains Arsenal and Manchester City, which is interesting because Arsenal and Manchester City are passing powerhouses of the Premier League. And we can also see that in principal component analysis, Leicester was pretty far away from all the other teams. So we added the points from the 2014-2015 season. Interestingly, even in this season, before Leicester shocked us all and ended up winning the title, they were still the most distinctive team, and they were still grouped with Arsenal and Manchester City, even for that season. And additionally, the team most similar to Leicester 15-16 in this way is Leicester 14-15. But this is all interesting and all, but the thing I really want you to get from this slide is the repeatability. Repeatability is a crucial thing for anything that we're trying to do that tries to pick up something like style. Because for one season, this method had the vector for one team here, for the next season that vector was here, for the next season that vector was here. It's just saying random things about that team. It's not saying something that repeatable that corresponds to something that you think corresponds to a quality of that team. So the repeatability, I drew some reference to. You have both Chelsea's points over here, both Spurs' points over here, both Southampton's points over here. Same for Liverpool. So it's a really repeatable method. And not just, I mean, this is the graphical way of seeing it, but it's repeatable even just when you look at the underlying number. It's a really repeatable method. And it gives us confidence that it's picking up on something which is the style of each team. So until this point is basically what the authors did with that original paper. But I took that idea and I wanted to translate it to a player level, to a recruitment. That was the ultimate objective. So how do we translate this idea to a player level? So first idea might be the relative frequency idea. So we're going to do the same thing that we just did for teams. We're going to see players' participation in different passing sequences, and we're going to see what percentage of a player's sequences correspond to which of the five categories. It's basically the same thing we just did for teams. The problem with this approach is that if you put me in Barcelona, I'm going to start performing the sequences that Barcelona do, but it's more because of my teammates and what they're trying to do, rather than what I'm trying to do. So you kind of want to eliminate the team effect from the player. So another idea might be this divergence idea. So the team uses an ABAB sequence 40% of the time, and a player of that team uses it 43% of the time. I'm using it proportionally more than my team. So I get a plus 0.3 score for that motif. And again, I can look at the divergence score for each player for each of the 5 different categories. Another idea is this, the team proportion idea. So what proportion of a team's instances of a certain category do I participate in? So if my team does ABAC 50 times in a match, and I participate in 25 of those, then I'm going to get a 50% score for that category. And I can look at what score I get for each of the 5 categories. Another idea is the 15 roles idea. So if you think of a player participating in an ABCA sequence, he could have participated as the A player, the B player, or the C player. So there's 3 different roles he could have played. in that sequence. So if you look at all the 5 different categories, there's going to be 15 different roles that he could be playing. And finally, we have 15 roles, relative frequencies ideas, which is that same thing, but now we're going to look at percentages. So what percentage of his roles is the A in an ABAB, what percentage of his roles is the B in an ABAB, etc. If you add all these numbers up, we have 5 numbers attributed to each player for the first idea, 5 for the second, 5 for the third, 15 for the fourth, and 15 for the fifth. So you add these, you get 45 numbers, 45 different numbers attributed to a player's participation in these passing networks. And this is the operationalization that I'm going to choose. So basically, I took all these numbers attributed to a player, and I plotted players in a 45-dimensional space. I just look at each of the 45 numbers and see where their point is with respect to other players. Now, hopefully this is useful, and we can use this, let's say, for recruitment. So let's answer that question. The question you want answered now is, how do we know that this is useful? Looking at players in that space. So the first thing is repeatability. Same thing as a team example. If this methodology wasn't repeatable, then we think that it's just saying random things about players. So if for one season, a vector's players in one area, next season here, next season here, next season here, it's not saying anything repeatable, it's not saying anything consistent that we might think is attributed to a quality, an underlying quality of the player. So repeatability is really important. Definitely this method is repeatable. And I won't go through the technical detail of how we check that. But the second thing you want to check is this, that certain output metrics cluster together. So as an example, I put here, if all the players who had a high number of key passes are relatively close together, as opposed to spread out randomly, then it provides evidence of this information being represented by their position in that space. So if we go back to the bank example, when we had all the green dots of clients who paid, all the red dots of clients who didn't pay, if you were able to look at the space where these points are, and they're all mixed together, they're a mesh of red and green dots, then when you think about a new client coming in and looking at his position in that space, well, you don't have confidence that you're going to be able to extract information about whether he's going to pay or not. So in a sense, what you want from that space is for the green points to be in an area, the red points to be in another area with a minimal amount of mixing, if that makes sense. So again, if we look at certain output metrics and they cluster together, then we can say something like, we're going to reward a player by his position in that space because his position in that space tells me something about how he will perform in this output metric. So the question is, if it fulfills these 2 criteria, how are we going to use it? So I think it's better to answer through some of the results. So this is a list I drew up for Premier League players. So what I did is I took all the Premier League players for last season, put them in that space, and I gave them points for how many key passes they made, but I also gave them points for how many key passes their neighbors made. And in that sense, I'm rewarding him being near to other people who are performing plenty of key passes. And the farther away you are, obviously the less points you award me for your amount of key passes. So it descends towards just rewarding your neighbors and rewarding less the people who are farther away from you. So this is a list of the 15 top ranked players in this pointing system that I just explained. It has some interesting things. So for example, Danny Drinkwater is ranked at number 8. So Danny Drinkwater is a player that everybody talked about last season, and we all agreed he had a really good season with Leicester, and he was one of the players who performed really well. Now if you just look at Danny Drinkwater's output in key passes made, he only made 34. He barely makes the top 50. I think he's number 49 in the league. Ramsey only made 33. Sterling only made 33. So we're picking up, and we're picking up on these players that are perhaps less obvious choices because they didn't perform, their output wasn't ranked highly, but we're still picking up on them through this method by rewarding them for their performance, for performing similar to players who have a high amount of key passes in this 45 number thing that I'm talking about. Other examples are you have Sissoko from Newcastle, Newcastle got relegated. We also have Ross Barkley from Everton. We have Chelsea players. Chelsea had a bad season. We still have Hazard and Williams. And we all have a lot of empirical opinion about the Premier League and about their players. So we can all look at this list and say, yeah, these are really good players from the Premier League. But if you think about these things, about the raw output of Danny Drinkwater, if you think about Sissoko actually playing for Newcastle, it makes them less obvious choices. So if you go to a league where we don't have as much opinion about the players, if you go to Romania, where you want to scout. Sometimes you go to the players of the previous champions. Sometimes you go to the list of top goal scorers. Sometimes you go to the list of top assisters. But you're maybe missing out on these players which weren't the obvious choices. And since we know the Premier League, we know they are good players. But you want to reward players for their performance in these that you don't know, in a less obvious way, let's say. I do the same list for the Bundesliga. Again, same idea. And once again, it's a good list of players. We have players from Cologne. We have players from Hamburg. We have players from Stuttgart. So again, we're picking up on players which perhaps weren't the obvious suspects. Another metric I used was using expected assists. So Opta provided me with their expected assist numbers, which rewards every pass that you make, what probability of it has turning into a shot that might turn into a goal. And again, this is a metric that clusters well, that fulfills that second criteria. And some interesting names that we have on here, we have Anthony Martial. He wasn't on the previous list. We have Tadic and Mahrez. Mahrez won the Player of the Year award, so obviously an interesting player. I like the fact we have the Pai. When he was in the Netherlands, he was really highly regarded. He had a terrible time in Man United, but you never know. I like the fact that we have Redmond and Arnautovic from Norwich and Stoke, because again, they're not obvious choices, and they play for teams who perhaps aren't the teams that you go and look at when you're looking at the Romanian league, the Finnish league, I don't know. And finally, I drew up a list of the same idea by rewarding you for your goals and your neighbor's goals. But I drew this up more as a counterexample, because as opposed to the other two metrics, as opposed to expected assists and key passes, when we look at these metrics, key pass, expected assists, they occur in certain areas of the space. Players who have a high number of key passes are appearing in certain areas, so it makes sense to reward a player for their precision in that space. With goals, it doesn't happen, which kind of makes sense if you think all these numbers that I took out come from information that's in the passing network data. So finishing maybe isn't well represented in these numbers. So when you look at goals, they're occurring mixed with all the other players. So one player with a high number of goals this year, another this year, and then mixed with the rest of the players. So ultimately, this same idea applied to goals is an idea that doesn't work. Finally, to show you another way that you could explore this concept of having the players in that space, this is called the topological data analysis graph. This is something I worked on my mathematics master's dissertation, and it's a bit like the component analysis, but it works a bit different. It's much more robust, and it's worked really well in some areas where principal component analysis didn't work that well. And what you get is you have nodes that represent zones in the space, like clusters. And the edges between the nodes are drawn in a way that allows you to see where these zones are respective to each other in this original 45-dimensional space. So it kind of gives you a picture of the players in that space, in a sense, where they are in relation to each other. So the good thing about this is that it shows you a graph which you can explore on your computer and then look where each player is occurring. I colored this graph by key passes. Maybe the color palette isn't the best. It was the day before I had to turn it in. And the dark blue nodes are zones where there's a low amount of key passes made. So zones where the average number of key passes is very low. And as you move towards lighter blue, greenish, and yellow, you move towards zones that have a higher average of key passes. This really yellow node, that's what we threw the palette off, is just Meza because he's really distinctive, so he forms his own cluster, and he has such a high number of key passes that he throws the whole coloring off, but I didn't have time to fix that. So to give you a taste, goalkeepers are in this very dark blue area over here. So we basically have two areas where there's a higher amount of key passes. We have this area right here. Again, Ozil, Fabregas, and Ramsey are the players that are in there. And we have this area over here, Silva, Eriksen, Payet, and Hazard are the players that are in there. So again, this gives you a very open exploration of the results. You can look at where players are occurring in the space, and it gives you an idea of which players might be interesting. So pick this node right here. This node I think is interesting because you have two zones with a high concentration of key passes. And this area is kind of the connection between the two zones. It's the intermediate zone. So we have a lot of players with key passes here, a lot of players with key passes here, and then you have an intermediate zone. It might be worthwhile to look at which players are in that zone. And here are some of the players that are occurring there. You have Mata, Villa, Yaya Toure, Mark Noble, Idrissa Gueye, good success story coming out of Aston Villa, Barkley, Bellerin. So you pick up on some interesting players, and this is something that you can just play with. It gives you a tool that you can explore a bit. Okay. So some closing thoughts. So some of the feedback that I've gotten is people want to know when I show them these list of players, people want to know what can I take about these players and then go to the pitch and identify them. Can I go to the pitch and then say, oh look, this is one of those players that is performing to this thing that David told me in that talk that day. And if you can't do this, if you can't verify on the pitch, if you can't go and directly observe it, then you kind of don't trust the method because it seems abstract, probably. I feel that this is a bit wrong because our brains can't process huge amount of information. So what we have is 45 numbers attributed to the 500 players of the Premier League. The reward system that I got relates where players are in that space to each other, and that's where we get the points from. My brain can't do that while I watch a football match, and I don't think anybody's brain can do that. And if you want something that your brain can do on the match, you want something that deals with a small amount of numbers. So again, going back to the bank example, it says that bank analysts provided rules of thumb using a small amount of the variables that they have available, and they say, give a loan if it's a woman, 3 children, married, yes, otherwise no. And I don't think bank analysts would be too happy about this because they're missing out on so much information. They're missing out on huge amounts of data that's been amassed for them to make the decision making better. Ultimately, I would say you have to trust math to do its job. But having said that, I don't want that to be interpreted as saying that traditional scouting and analytical scouting can't complement each other and can't cooperate, because I feel that they can. And you have to trust both bodies of knowledge in a way. So something that you could do is you have your scouts bring you a list of 10 players. You get the analysts, they'll look at the graph and find 10 players that are young that are similar to these 10 players that the scouts brought you. And in that sense, we trust the judgment of the scouts to provide us this list of 10 players. We trust that they are picking up on those players because they have valuable knowledge inside their brains, and we trust the math to pick up the other players. But we have to trust both bodies of knowledge to get the most out of both of these areas. Finally, I also wanted to say that this methodology I'm showing you, I don't think it's the absolute and ultimate truth about player creativity. I don't want to sell it like the holy grail and stop looking. You can just come to me and I'll tell you which players are creative, which players have the highest key passing ability or something like this. And if this is what you're expecting from analytics, for it to be the discovery of ultimate discoverable truths, then it just doesn't work like that. It tries to extract information from the databases that we have and aid decision making to make it better. Having said that though, I think that there is an important lesson to be learned from this methodology. And more than its results, I feel it's the idea that it brings forward. So football analytics are maybe a bit too focused on events and their properties. And I feel that the real information that is to be gained, football is a really low scoring affair, so it's from sequences of events. A pass here, a dribble there, another pass that leads to a shot. That's what leads to scoring opportunities. That's what really leads to winning games, to winning tournaments. So what you really want is to take and be able to manage the sequentiality of the data. Now that's not always obvious. And here we took sequences of passes and we manipulated them in maybe an unorthodox way. But this unorthodox way of looking at sequences of events ended up being really successful to pick up something like creative talent in players. So I think it leaves an open door, which is what I plan to do with my time later this year, explore more football networks and sequences of events and how we can kind of create these categories that we can then quantify and see if using big data approaches we can find some more valuable information. And that's it.